It was Egypt's bloodiest day since the uprising 2 years ago. Hundreds of people were killed yesterday when riot police stormed protest camps set up by the Muslim Brotherhood.
The streets of Cairo were quiet overnight as thousands of troops enforced a curfew, but there are fears the violence will continue.
Journalist and Middle East analyst Saka Al-Makhadhi joins us now. Very good morning to you.
Good morning, Louise.
I mean, very disturbing figures and pictures, all the rest of it coming from Egypt yesterday. I mean, what do you know about what happened and how many people have been killed? Because the figures are not clear at this point, are they?
Well, of course, and the army is trying to downplay the figures. And of course, the Muslim Brotherhood and organisations that support the Muslim Brotherhood outside of the country are really trying to push up those numbers. But really, we're not going to get a clear figure until the dust has settled. But this really is, the culmination of decades of battles between the Muslim Brotherhood and the army. And the army has really felt that now is the time that it's able to crack down to take revenge on the Muslim Brotherhood while it feels that it's still got some legitimacy amongst the Egyptian people.
And Saka, as those eyewitness accounts come in, very different accounts come in, but a picture is clear of extreme violence, and we know there were children in the square, and this will emerge over the next few days. Because of the nature of the action that was taken, what do you think the long-term implications are? Because as we've seen before in the Middle East, when there's a moment of extreme violence, if you like disproportionate violence, it can have a dramatic effect on what happens next.
Well, that's exactly what happened just over a year ago. The last time the army was in charge, it committed alleged massacres of protesters, of unarmed protesters, in a very similar way to what happened yesterday. And they lost legitimacy very quickly, and it forced even more people onto the streets, and we saw the moves towards democratic elections. I think what's really surprising about what's happening now in Egypt is that the army still doesn't seem to have yet lost the legitimacy it believes it gained when it jumped on the bandwagon of the mass protests when people were really had enough of the Muslim Brotherhood presidency. And it feels that now is the time because it still retains that legitimacy. And Egypt really is divided now between pro-Morsi, pro-Muslim Brotherhood supporters and anti-Muslim Brotherhood supporters. And it feels to me like there are still a lot of anti-Muslim Brotherhood, the anti-Muslim Brotherhood camp still feels like it's burying its head in the sand and that it is willing to ignore the massacres. But I'm just wondering how long that can go on and how many more red lines the army is able to cross before people turn against the army.
I mean, it's clear it's a very dangerous time for people living in Cairo, isn't it? And you say you can't measure what the sort of support is because now there is a curfew. So what sort of begs the question is what is the way forward from what happened yesterday?
Well, it's clear that the Muslim Brotherhood isn't, or Muslim Brotherhood supporters at least, aren't going to lay down and take what happened yesterday. They already tried to form a new protest camp that was broken up very swiftly.
Yes.
But I think across Egypt we're going to see more protests and more demonstrations. If we've learned anything from the Arab Spring, it is that killings and protests and this violence, the escalation of violence, just brings more people out onto the streets.
And what about, further elections? I mean, does that go on hold again, or what happens?
Well, the army, when it did take power about 6 weeks ago, did promise that it was going to restore democracy as soon as possible. But I think, what the world is saying now, what international leaders are saying, is that there can be no restoration of democracy without somehow involving the Muslim Brotherhood, on practical grounds, because around half of the country voted for the Muslim Brotherhood or its allies in the elections last year. And so to disenfranchise such a large proportion of the country isn't going to calm the violence and isn't going to solve the problem in Egypt in any way whatsoever.
Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.